We're so grateful that you're here. We're going to light a peace candle for our devotion together today, recognizing Spirit is always with us. But as Reverend Christy Ramage and I, Will McGarvey, come together for this moment, let's hear this Native American prayer called I Seek Strength. It's believed to have been written in the 1700s by a Native American, and it goes like this. Let me walk in beauty and make my eyes ever behold the red and purple sunset. Make my hands respect the things you have made and my ears sharp to hear your voice. Make me wise so that I may understand the things that you have taught my people. Let me learn the lessons you have hidden in every leaf and rock. I seek strength not to be greater than my brother, but to fight my greatest enemy, myself. Make me always ready to come to you with clean hands and straight eyes, so when life fades as a fading sunset, my spirit may come to you without shame. Oh, Amen. So grateful to have you here. We didn't do a devotion last week because I was on vacation, so thanks for being ready to do one again today, and especially after all that's been going on in our culture. It's good to be together. It's good to hear your voice. It was good to have a Wednesday afternoon social hour today and hear people go deep in their own sharing about their hopes and dreams for our country and what's going on right now.
Yeah, and I think as we begin simply to acknowledge the heavy-heartedness, acknowledging the death of George Floyd and the protest, the outrage that those responsible out us, just take the faith to understand the force of the rage, the systemic racism that is just layered upon itself, so that his death was the point where that expression started to happen. And just to be really clear, I think both of us as people who are white, I mean, to be able to express our grief and our solidarity and our complicity in some ways in the systemic racism that defines this country.
Yeah, I think it was good for us to be able to share our griefs and our hopes for the future, but also to recognize that there's so much work undone in our culture, and that I think it was over 1,000 people being killed at the hands of police since 2015 is a huge number. 1,200, 1,300 people, I think, is the number that I saw in the news the other day. But to think that we become okay with that, and to see something as blatant as the George Floyd murder awoke something within us. And I think there's also this other collective grief as we go through caring for each other during this season of COVID-19, and many people feeling as if they're safe at home and they're doing their part to be able to flatten the curve. There's a whole lot of other people who have lost their jobs, who don't have income, who may not have received the $1,200 from the government to help them with their rent, who are maybe receiving eviction notices right now, and to recognize that there's that level of stress going on in our society right now as well, and that not all of us are going through this season of caring for COVID-19 with the same resources or resilience and ability to be able to survive if we don't have savings, or if we're on life's edge, or if we've been forced to work in an essential job where others may not have had to do that as well. So I think there's a lot of angst in our society right now, and it's on a very visceral level because it's a life and death issue for so many.
Exactly. And it's become disproportionately a life and death issue for communities of color also, which is part of what you're speaking to, so that the stress level is even more. But the historic racism that has moved us to this place in time where communities of color often do not have access to the same financial resources, to the same medical resources, to the same educational resources, and that there are fewer resources within communities of color to respond to COVID. And what's happening is that the death rate within those communities is higher than in comparable communities, white communities. And just to realize how racism is manifesting itself through COVID, and that is, again, another layer of the racism that we participate in.
Well, the systemic racism that we're talking about is something that we don't often recognize. So often in our culture, we think of racism as a specific act or a specific idea about another person. And we often look at racism in a very individualized way of an interaction between one person and another. And sometimes it shows up that way. But oftentimes it's the systemic racism that's a part of our economic system. That means people of color are living in more polluted areas. They may not have as much access to health care, or the economic inequality that they and their family have existed within in the last few decades or centuries has kept them from getting the resources that would allow them to survive a season like this. And recognizing that sometimes it's the employment policies, sometimes it's the housing policies, sometimes it's the discrimination of an individual boss that may or may not hire a person of color or allow for the advancement of a person of color that contributes to all of these stressors, right? And then when we see more people in communities of color dying from COVID, part of that's an expression of the economic inequality of people as well.
Right, and I think part of the key to our, again, as people who are white, part of our understanding of this is that, as you had said previously, that racism is often understood as an action or as a clear expression of hatred, which many of us would say is not who we are. So again, this has been informed by the book White Fragility, this whole insight into the reality that as long as we're able to say that racism is something that is based in visible hatred and visible actions of hate, then we are not participants in that. If we are people who are not expressing that type of behavior or feeling that type of hatred. But the reality is that in these economic disparities, we benefit, we who are white are privileged. And so when we talk about disparities in communities of color, we're actually not only saying that some people have been oppressed by those systems, but some of us have been raised. And when you put those together, it's that our privilege is really based on the oppression of people of color. And that's the part of racism, I think, that often is not acknowledged and often is not understood. And that I think in this time, we are really called to identify and name and wrestle with, that our privilege is often not clear to us. And that because of that, we behave in ways that are racist, but don't even realize that we're doing it.
Or ways that have become normal as people project onto us an entitlement that we don't deserve in our culture. Yeah. So it's White Fragility is this book, and you mentioned it in your article for the newsletter. There's some great YouTube videos for that's done by Dr. Robin DiAngelo discussing that. I'm going to post an article about that and an interview with her on our East County Shared Ministry Facebook page for members of our congregation that want to take a look at that. And that's a great book to start thinking of new ways to understand ourselves during this time, and how to be present for others. And it's also an important time for us to recognize that there's a lot of language that gets used, and there's a lot of culture war even that gets used around Black Lives Matter or All Lives Matter. And how do we stand up, even as Judy Moore said in our service last week, all lives can't matter until Black Lives Matter, until we've made that a priority, right? And we as people of faith might want to even use a little different language, that Black lives are sacred, and that we live in a culture that doesn't hold all Black lives as sacred. And as we lift up our values as people of faith and encourage our country to live more into the values that we see from our faith and instilled even in the Constitution, working for a world where white lives and Black lives are all held as sacred, and the way that we protect them with our institutions matter, we'll be able to find language that is easier for us to claim as people of faith, and being able to live into this moment as well.
Yes, and I also think that as people of faith, that gives us some place to turn when despair and depression and helplessness and hopelessness is so tempting. That it's important, I think, as people of faith, that we claim this tradition that honors community, that honors each individual life as sacred, and that we're called into this work to really face into the barriers that make that not true in this country, face into the oppression, face into the injustice, and realize that our faith tradition supports us in doing that. That justice is so fundamental, I think, to who we are as Christian people. And justice and peace, unconditional love is the unconditional love that creates the sacred space for everyone to belong. And then from within that space, we strengthen each other to do the work for justice. And that just seems so key in this moment, that we claim the legacy of our faith and the strength of our faith to allow us to be present and open during this time.
Yeah, I was listening to a sermon by Reverend Dr. William Barber with the Poor People's Campaign last night, and boy, it's a 40-minute sermon. We'd never get away with that in our church, would we? 40-minute sermon. But he was asked to give this sermon in back east somewhere months and months ago, but it was such a moment that he gave this sermon as if it were a public letter to the world, really calling upon us to transform the world and to recognize that even before COVID, 700 people were dying a day, from different poverty-based deaths. And 140 million people are living in poverty in the United States right now, but a lot of the numbers that we're hearing from our government around employment numbers or percentages they don't measure whether or not people can afford to live in our society with the rising costs of living and the lack of a real living wage that's enforced in our country. And in order for us to recognize what's going on now with the extra stressors of COVID-19, of the extra stressors of needing to fight for our lives in the streets, how do we go back and remember the inequities that have led to what we've already become comfortable with? So many people dying because they don't have health insurance. We've become okay with that. And now that we're in this shelter in place and we're trying to recuperate from COVID-19, 40% of the people that make $40,000 or less in our society have lost their jobs. And because our healthcare has become so tied in with our job, all of those people lost their healthcare if they had it as well. So how do we look at all of these inequalities and recognize that all of this stress, all of this angst contributes to the feeling that some people really don't matter in our society. They really don't, they're not being included in the people and their needs are not being included in the basic human needs for healthcare. Or, 1 in 5 people are experiencing food insecurity right now. How do we create a culture where that level of anxiety for basic everyday needs can be met, and we can create a society where people can make enough to live on, given the increasing costs of living expenses? And we should know better than that here in California, right?
Yeah, yeah. And it's almost as if what's happening now is that the blindfolds are being ripped off, and the statistics that you're quoting are now being revealed to us in very dramatic ways. And that's part of the outrage. That's part of the protest. It's that frustration with the inequalities that have been perpetuated for so long, and as you said, are just normalized in our culture. And it's like now, hopefully, one of the consequences of what's going to happen in response to the protests is that we will begin to see things differently. We will not be able to ignore realities. We will not be able to simply let things be normalized and keep going, but that we're going to have to stop and actually look and see and respond in a different way. And I think that's not only to the present realities and to translate the statistics into human beings too. That these are mothers who can't feed their kids. These are people who are sick who can't get medical care. That to humanize the statistics. But then also, I was listening to someone last night who was saying that he feels that part of what we're being invited into as a country is into a sacred conversation about the legacy of slavery. So to actually speak about the specifics now as they're manifesting in terms of inadequate housing, unemployment, limited access to healthcare. I mean, those are the manifestations of racism now, but to actually go back through history and to begin, or at least incorporate the beginning of this. And what is it to be a country based on slavery? What is it to be a country whose economic survival was dependent upon people being owned by other people? I mean, how has that so distorted our understanding of what it is to be in relationship to others, and distorted our understanding of economics? It's distorted who we are, I think, as a country and as a people. And that if we begin also to take the blindfold off of that, to actually look places we haven't looked and have conversations we haven't had. Again, as you said, as we've normalized these racist systemic realities and just kind of kept living, if we're forced now to stop and to actually confront these realities and begin to understand, what does it mean that people owned other people, that they were that they could be abused, they could be killed, they could be raped. I mean, there were no limits. If all this person could do whatever they wanted to do, how does that inform who we are?
Bishop Yvette Flunder, our UCC colleague at the City of Refuge in Oakland, has this great quote on a picture that she posts on Facebook. She says, "If you didn't want us to be a part of your country, you should have picked your own cotton."
Yeah.
And there's sometimes the wake-up call needs to be that blatant for us to understand, but oftentimes we don't have a sense of our own history to realize that there's never been this real leveling of every American citizen. And even the Reconstruction after the Civil War never really restored African Americans to full ability to be full participants in our democracy. There was a lot of pushback, and the North had to basically give up on ensuring even the voting rights of African Americans in the South after a certain point, right?
Yeah. And so I think part of what we're called to in this time is to see what we have not seen, to acknowledge what we have chosen to be blind to, and to begin to speak to each other and allow our faith to inform those conversations, so that those conversations come from a place of affirmation of the possibility for transformation. I mean, I also think it's really, really important that we trust that this can change, that our hearts can be transformed, that our culture can be transformed. Even though I know racism has persisted and continues to persist and do its damage, but that our faith, I think, calls us to continue to hope that healing is possible and real, and that takes our involvement and investment to make that possible.
And I think we are becoming more empowered to be able to challenge those messages we're receiving from our political leaders or even our economic leaders that have pitted poor white people against poor black people in a kind of a vicious cycle that doesn't recognize that all people that are kind of held in those lower classes are being used by folks that are in the higher classes for their own economic gain. And the more we're able to see through those messages, the less they're able to pit us against each other.
Those who have eyes to see. And part of this journey, I believe, is seeing clearly the abuse, the manipulation, the racism, the destruction, and to commit to transforming it. So thank you for this conversation. It feels important that we speak to each other, that we speak to the church, and that we continue to have these conversations in the culture at large.
There are plenty of other books out there that folks can use to do their own work. And of course, we encourage ourselves and our members of our congregation and others to seek out some of those authors and speakers. And if you can spend some time on YouTube, even listening to Dr. Robin DiAngelo or others, just go onto YouTube and you can just put a search in there for white fragility or for anti-racist training. There's some great ones out there, and we need to each do our own work as well as we prepare ourselves to be the church for the future.
Thank you. There's a lot of work to be done, and a lot of people have done wonderful work, so we're joining that work. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Be well.